Mariya Javed-Payne, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is truly mine. I'm excited to dive into our topic of conversation today. I feel like there's going to be a lot of insights that myself and my audience aren't super aware of so far. So it's going to be good to see where we are in this time in 40 minutes later. So before we do dive into that, can you give us a little context about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. So I'm Mariya Javed-Payne, and I am a somatic psychotherapist. I'm based in Minnesota in the United States, and I do a lot of things, but particularly I work with a lot of different clients who are struggling with a variety of issues in their life, but specifically I work with PTSD, and I'm also a breathwork facilitator. So that's the most recent thing that I've been doing is hosting breathwork groups. I also teach Brainspotting, so I'm an international Brainspotting trainer and teach clinicians, coaches, therapists how to utilize this modality. So that's briefly a little bit about me.
And what got you started on this path? I feel like there's a lot of healing that needs to be done in the world right now, so it makes sense. But I don't believe that you chose to do what you've done and what you've been doing just yesterday or a year ago, right? I'm sure this path started much earlier. So roll back the years and tell us a little bit more about what got you into this in the first place.
Sure. So I am a recovering addict, and growing up, I had a lot of family trauma. But I also had a very, very dark addiction for a long time to opiates and stimulants. And so I was really, really addicted and went to rehab 8 different times from my teen years all the way up to age 20. And so really actually learned a lot about psychology and mental health and addiction through my own life experiences, and then trying to get my own healing for those experiences. So the path eventually led me to getting a degree in clinical social work. It just felt like the calling, like once you've gone through really challenging things, you kind of learn that you can reach people by connecting on a very intuitive, somatic body level because you understand what they're going through. So kicked off my career in counseling and addiction work. And I primarily also focus on addictions as well. But then I went into somatic psychotherapy right when I graduated from my master's. I was really seeing the limitations of talk therapy. And I went to rehab 8 times. Like, I didn't get it. I spent 2.5 years of my life institutionalized, and I did not stay sober from rehab. So when I kind of happened upon a Brainspotting therapist, and I started receiving Brainspotting as a client in 2017, I walked out of that first session and I was like, I just did 6 months of therapy in an hour. Where was this my whole, during my teenage years? So I was just immediately hooked. I was really fascinated by how neuroscience based it was, how body focused it was, while also working with the mind. And I just made like massive strides in my own healing. I'd been sober for about 7 years at that point, and I really feel like my actual recovery started in 2017 when I started to do Brainspotting every week, and I did it for years every week. So it totally rebuilt my nervous system. And I was like, I have to get trained in this. I didn't even finish graduating school. I got trained in it and then I graduated. So a few years later, I had the privilege and honor of becoming a trainer and being able to teach other people from all over the world about this modality. And it's really my life purpose to get this to every community that I can think of, because of how beautifully simple it is, and everyone has access. If you have eyeballs, you have access to this. And even if you don't have eyeballs, there's so many tenets to Brainspotting that can help in the healing process. So that's a bit about how I'm here.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think it's always great when someone's gone down the path to find their own course of healing and has ended up coming on the other side, healed themselves, and then goes on to show everyone the way that they did it. And, you get to that point where you can't deny it and you can't like hide it away. It's like you feel like you're keeping something from the world if you do, right? But with that being said, I am not necessarily super engrossed in the world of mental health, but I'm also very aware of a lot of mental health modalities. But this is the first time I've ever heard of brain spotting, and I'm sure it's the first time my audience have heard of it as well. So can you give us a definition of what exactly that is and how it differs from other forms of therapy?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the main points that I want to make here today is that brain spotting is really versatile. And so you don't have to have a mental health condition to benefit from it. But brain spotting is a somatic based processing modality that uses the connection of your eyes and the somatic experience or the felt sense of whatever it is that you're wanting to focus on or work on. And
can you define somatic as well for the listeners too?
Sure. Yeah. So somatic means body based. It's coming from the body. So if you and I were, connecting in my office at some point, and you were talking to me, let's say about, I want to get really good at my golf swing, right? I'm struggling with it. When I go to competitions, I'm struggling and I can't get the scores that I want. And so we would pinpoint in your swing or whatever it is in your sport, where that piece gets stuck for you, right? Like wherever you're feeling there's something off, or maybe there's anxiety or whatever about the performance itself. And when we pinpoint that, I'd ask you, what are you noticing in your body? So if you say you're feeling anxious or you feel like there's something stuck when you're, swinging your arm or whatever, I'd say, let's feel into that. What is that like? So somatic, it means of the body. Soma is of the body. And then what we would do after is we would locate an eye position that connects you to that feeling of stuckness. And so why does that, connect together? Well, our eyes are an extension of our brain. Literally, our optic nerve goes directly into our subcortical brain, which is the midbrain. It's what we've called the reptilian brain. It's more reflexive. It's based on survival. The neocortex, or the frontal lobe, is our thinking brain, where you and I are talking right now. We're using our thinking brain to do that. But as you're feeling into me and I'm feeling into you, that's your subcortical brain. Like, oh, here's this person. They seem warm. They seem open, connected, right? That's that felt sense that you get. So what we are accessing in brain spotting is the felt sense. It's the body, and the body is, coming through the felt sense is coming through the brainstem. It's the tactile, it's the peripheral nerves and the nervous system. So our eyes being an extension of our brain, what brain spotting, the premise of brain spotting, it's actually it came originally from EMDR. So the developer of brain spotting, David Gran, was an EMDR therapist. Some of your listeners are probably aware of what EMDR is, but eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And they're using eye movement to help integrate material that people are working through, or trauma, and release trauma. With brain spotting, we're using focused eye positions. So David Gran stumbled upon this really interesting phenomenon that as he was working with somebody, he noticed that as they were, talking about something, they kept looking in this one spot and their eyes would do this little freeze and wobble. As he was doing eye movement, she would have this little freeze. This was one of his clients. So what is that? Well, so let me back up. The eyes are an extension of the brain, and the brain is constantly scanning the environment. It's constantly scanning when you're looking out in the world at objects or things going on, but it's also scanning inside of you. Right. So if you've ever daydreamed, did you ever stare off into space?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever done that?
Yeah, definitely. I still do.
Me too. We all do. So wherever you were looking when you were daydreaming, that's called a brain spot. And it's where your brain is orienting to information that's actually inside of you that you're pulling up as you're thinking or feeling whatever it was that you were daydreaming about. So you can see, even as I'm talking, I'm looking in all these different areas, right? That is my brain orienting and accessing where that information actually lives inside of the brain. So when you pair felt sense and you connect that to an issue that you want to, improve in your life, we can locate these brain spots. We can locate where that information actually lives inside of your brain, your subcortex and your neocortex. And once we hold the brain spot there, we have clients keep their eyes on that spot, and we ask them to just continuously mindfully focus on whatever felt sense is kind of coming up for them. the brain actually starts to reorganize, rewire, and reprocess whatever it is that they're working on. So it's a very, very powerful modality. It's hard to explain it until you kind of go through it and get the actual experience of it. But Brainspotting's premise is based on the orienting reflex, which I just described to you. We're all orienting all the time. Our brain is orienting through all of our senses, but it devotes a lot of energy to visual processing. And we then focus on the second aspect of the premise of Brainspotting, which is the scanning. So if you think of your autonomic nervous system, and let's say you get a cut on your leg, right? And if it's a minor cut, you won't have to do anything. Your body's going to take care of it by itself. We have this beautiful innate healing capacity inside of all living beings. And if the body has the resources and the tools to take care of it, it will. With trauma or performance issues, which often performance issues are related to traumas, it's really interesting when I work with people, you back up into their lives and all this attachment stuff or trauma stuff starts to come out, sports injuries or other things that they experience working, with a team or coaches, bad experiences that they've had, anxiety about, being in front of an audience or a group of people. So it all ties back into like the human experience, that things that most people are all, worried about or have negatively been impacted by. So anyway, if your autonomic nervous system can heal, if you have a cut on your leg, great. So that means the brain is scanning and trying to keep homeostasis, which is very, very powerful down to the DNA blueprint force that we have. Our bodies like to stay in balance, right? And if you have an emotional condition, something happens, something difficult, you're going to have your body try to heal it. But emotional conditions often require connection and attachment. That's the medicine or ingredients that are needed. So maybe for a cut, it's like you need a scab, you need the white blood cells and red blood cells to go in there. Maybe you need a little ointment. Maybe you eventually have to get antibiotics or something if it's not healing by itself. For emotional or performance things, we need connection. We need a sense of safety. Once you have that, and that's often what we're trying to do as a brain spotting therapist, is like provide this really profound sense of attunement and connection to people on a body level, body to body. And we set up an eye position. You set up this focused mindfulness where people start to get into the felt sense and you have this sense of safety around you. The brain begins to rewire and reprocess pretty much on its own. It's really neat. So
yeah,
that's a little bit about brain spotting.
It's a little bit, but there's a lot packed in there as well. So,
I teach like 30-hour trainings. So.
Yeah, makes sense. Like, I'm starting to understand why. So coming back to the specific idea of like finding that point, right? Got a lot of questions, so I'm just going to try and center on one to begin with. Are we essentially looking to try and get to that place of, let's say, a certain trauma that has been locked into our subconscious, wherever it lives within our brain or within our mind and our body? Are we trying to almost access that place in order to start recontextualizing, re-understanding, and, like I said, providing that safe space so we can start to create these new neural pathways that allow us to almost heal that to a degree? Like, what are we doing in terms of going back to that trauma? You mentioned obviously that the brain starts to create different connections and everything along those lines, but what is that process exactly? Like, what are we doing there? Because obviously, yeah, if you go to maybe hypnotherapy or CBT or something along those lines, the idea is to try and change the perspective that maybe you have on that situation. It's not to ignore that it happened, but it's, taking yourself back there as an adult when maybe you experienced that trauma as a child and recognizing that, okay, well, that is not your life anymore. That is not what you're living anymore. And this happened for X reason, whatever it might be. So what is the purpose of going back there, and what are we trying to accomplish by going in there? More about not what we're trying to accomplish, because obviously we're trying to overcome that, but what are we doing within that to overcome it? It's probably the better question. Yeah,
that's a great question. So the good news is you don't necessarily have to like go and find a trauma. It can be, if you're struggling, it could be like some people are going to come in and say, yeah, I have this issue and I know it, like I had a car accident and now I know I can't drive because I'm so scared of getting in a car. That's very direct, right? It's like a single incident issue. You know exactly what to grab at and work towards. But if it's sports performance or other things, you would you can start in present time, like however the issue is showing up in your life. And the beauty of brain spotting is that we don't have like a fixed target. And that's what makes it so accessible to people, is that you can show up exactly as who you are. And we're going to just remain open and curious to see what your subcortical brain actually shows us and where it takes us. So our goal is to identify whatever it is that you're wanting to focus on, and then get the felt sense experience of that, however it's real to the person. I know there's so much neurodiversity out there, not everybody even like feels things in their bodies, but however it's real to the person, if it's a looping thought in your mind, if it's an idea, we're going to identify what that is and figure out how that shows up in your reality, whether it's in the body or in the mind. And then we use a pointer. So this is what it looks like, and it's extendable. And so this is what I'm doing in the session is I'm actually, after we've gotten the person connected to the issue, we're going to actually scan the line of sight, and we're going to start looking for reflexes that show up. Those are subcortical. Reflexes are not conscious. And so we're looking for communication from the deep brain. And as we locate where that spot is and we fine tune where it is, this is just one technique. There's a whole bunch of them, but we're going to locate in the visual field where that spot is. And you'd be surprised. People are like, oh my God, what is that? It's right there. Like they start to, I don't know why that feels like way more intense over here than it did over here. And so it's really fascinating to see the deep brain, expressing and communicating material that's held inside that's related to whatever it is that we've activated. So once we stop there, that's when that processing starts. And so as you're asking the client to connect and stay with whatever the issue is, that's when the brain starts to scan. Same way it would scan if you had a cut on your leg. It'd be like, oh, okay, there's an open wound right here. We need to send help. It's going to be like, oh yeah, here's this place that's dysregulated inside of the brain. Maybe we disconnected from it. We had to dissociate. We had to pretend it didn't happen. We had to put it away because we didn't have the resources at the time. Like I said, safety and connection. But now seems like, Mari's a safe person here right now, as relatively safe as, anyone can be. And the brain and body are going to start to reprocess it. People will then often travel back on those neural networks. The neural networks are connected in the brain. And so memory networks show up. You might start out with that original issue and end up totally somewhere else because it's somehow related inside of the neural networks of the brain. Other times people are just staying with that one issue. It's very open-ended and we can just see however people process. But the goal is essentially to discharge the activation that's stored. So if you came in saying, I'm really anxious about this performance that I have or this, tournament that I'm going to, the goal would be to help you discharge the anxiety out of that so that when you think about going to your tournament, you're thinking about being excited. You're thinking about being at the best, having the best performance that you could think of, and that the negative charge isn't there. So we're not trying to get it to like totally go away, but the memory to go away or something like that. We're just taking the dysregulation, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, those states out, so that you can be in homeostasis and go kick butt.
I like it. So when you go through that process, would you then go back over with the pointer and then essentially you would find in that area things aren't quite as charged? Is that something that people experience? Like you go back there and, they don't feel anything anymore?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And that could take one session or it could take, 10 sessions, 20 sessions. It depends on the complexity. I mean, I treat specifically complex PTSD. So I'm working with people who've had a lot of trauma, and those sessions can, take a long time. If I see someone who was in a car accident or is working on athletes in general tend to process really quickly because you're already so connected to your bodies, right? And your fine motor skills and all of that are really exceptional. So the processing tends to go much quicker with athletes, I've seen. But yeah, the goal is to help to release the intensity there so that, yeah, when you're looking at that spot, it's just not there anymore.
And coming back to that release, so obviously, like you said, it needs safety and connection. Does the brain kind of come to a point of like, okay, Mara's in the room, she's a safe person, I feel connected here. What is the process then to release per se, and why does it, with some, obviously, like you said, the complexity? I'm trying to ask questions that I know are down to individual individuality at the end of the day, but I'm trying to get an understanding of the exact process of what someone might go through without kind of being specific about this, but like the type of trauma that they went through, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So let's think about how bodies release, right? How do we release emotions? How do we release stress? Sometimes we cry, we might shake, we might feel really tired. We might have expressions of emotion or anger. Sometimes people don't really feel a whole lot, but there's still processing that's happening in the back of the, like I said, in the midbrain, in the deep brain. But yeah, crying, shaking, tingling, twitching, coughing. There's all sorts of stuff that subcortically the body's doing to let go of things, and we just allow it. I'm not weird about any of that stuff. So I've had people feel kind of nauseous sometimes if they were working on something pretty traumatic, and we're just there to be a loving support for them. Sometimes the body will try to complete a movement that it didn't get to complete during the stress. So all of these examples that I gave would fit in that category as well. But sometimes people's bodies will do certain movements, or they'll want to do a movement. So we allow them to have that sense of completion, because the body's like, oh, I finally can do this thing now that I didn't get to do when the experience was happening. Say if like a group of kids was like making fun of you, right, on the playground, you maybe would want to like punch them, or fight them off or run away. It's the fight and the flight, right? And maybe you couldn't, you just froze in the moment because there was a group of them and it was just one of you, right? And the body intuitively decides, it's not usually our choice, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is the survival response we're going to have. We usually don't have choice about that because it's so subcortical and reflexive. So you come to my office later and we're processing this trauma on the playground that then eventually kept you from playing kickball or whatever, right? Here we are, we go back to that memory. The client might have tears. They might feel shame. Their face might get a little red. Their shoulders might go down, kind of curling in for protection. And maybe they want to hit somebody, right? So I'd give them a pillow and I'd ask them to gently like squeeze it, or we would stand up against the wall and push against the wall, always very slowly. We don't reenact the incident itself, but we're giving the body the chance to let go of that stored charge. And people have relief from like pain issues by doing this work, injuries, chronic pain. We can actually just do something called body spotting, which is where we actually put the pointer on wherever the pain is in the body, and we look for where the eyes orient right as you make contact with that area. So you can notice as soon as I made contact, my eyes moved a little. So that's the brain spot, as my brainstem is picking up that there's something touching here that's not my own hand, and it's orienting. And so then I would have the client process whatever is showing up as we feel into like shoulder pain, for example. So there's a lot of access points. And like I said, it's really versatile.
Do you mind me asking, Mary, what your physical response was when you did this for the first time?
Oh my gosh. Trying to think. I remember like having like shakes, like my body was like twitching. I had some tears. And I've had just wild responses over the years that I've had myself and seen in clients. Like the autonomic nervous system is pretty amazing. Like it's almost alien-like. Like when you let go of the thinking brain and you allow the body to like do what it knows how to do, it almost feels like something is happening to you, but it's your own body that's doing it. And it might not make sense to your thinking brain why this is coming up, but if you're shaking or twitching, it's like, our teeth are chattering or something like that. It's a discharge, often like a freeze response that's getting released from all of the nerves. And tingling also can be a thing. So if you have maybe numbness in an area, that starts to tingle and you're kind of waking up the nervous system again. So a lot of different ways that can show up.
Yeah, super interesting. And coming back to that person, for example, who is traumatized about going back into a car because they've had a car crash, for example, I'm curious about when they step back into that car after they've dealt with the trauma, what is that response like? Is it completely neutral? Are they still kind of aware of what happens? Are they kind of parking that to the side, or do they just feel completely in a different way about the whole situation?
I think it depends on the person and their history. If you have really, really complex PTSD, there's more of those neural networks that are connected to danger, right? There's like a lot of danger that the body has experienced. So it can be harder to release, and it might take more time. But I've definitely worked with a lot of people who had phobias of certain things, driving, snakes, whatever. And we did a handful of brain spotting sessions, or 1 or 2 brain spotting sessions, and they can get in the car and it's like they know that something happened, but it's just a thought now. It's not they're not feeling it. It's not dysregulating them. It's like, oh yeah, that's a thing that happened, and that's not now. This is different. I'm safe, right? So the charge of it hopefully leaves, and we might need to do a handful of sessions to get it to a complete resolution, but usually we see a reduction happening each time.
Yeah, I can imagine there's probably quite an initial resolution to the trauma. Let's put it down to percentages. Let's say, 50% of it is done potentially in the first session, a big impact because maybe it's visited for the first time. And then it's that extra 10%, I can imagine, or something similar like that.
Yeah, depending on how many of those connections are plugged into other areas of that person's life, it could take, more and more sessions. But it's the fastest tool I've ever learned. That's why I'm obsessed with it. I brain spot all the time. I mean, essentially we're all brain spotting all the time because we're orienting and we're looking here and there. What we're doing in brain spotting is harnessing the orienting reflex that we're all doing, and we've framed it now in a modality that's connected to offering healing to people.
And why is this concept so esoteric and not known? Because like I said, I'm not unaware. I'm kind of tuned into this world and I've not come across it before. So pretty fascinating that it's only just come to light to me. So why is it that if for someone who's not even interested in this world, they probably wouldn't even have a clue?
Yeah, well, it's a whole rabbit hole conversation, but I'll keep it brief. So brain spotting has been around for 20 years. This is year 21. And it takes, at least in the psychotherapy world, it takes 30 or 40 years for a therapy to become really well known and evidence-based. So part of the reason I think why people haven't heard about it is that it's not evidence-based practice, with the stamp, right? And there's a lot of funding that goes to evidence-based practices, and to get that funding to, propel those randomized clinical trials and research takes a lot of organization and effort. And we're working on that as an org, but at year 20, right, we've had maybe 12 research articles done so far, and the studies are showing that it's equally comparable to EMDR, if not better. In certain contexts. So pretty rapid. And I think the other part of it that's difficult is it's really hard to explain things that are subjective, right? And to do research on them. It's a lot of what we do as therapists is very subjective. And if we're going to make that into randomized controlled studies, you have to make things very objective. And brain spotting is focused on attunement. It's focused on receiving people as they are, who they are fully. They can show up without needing to accommodate the therapist. It's very open-ended. And so we really get to have an open frame and adapt the work that we're doing to each individual versus a lot of other therapies that are certain, right? They're certainty based. It's this is the protocol. This is what you do. And I know our frontal lobe loves certainty, and the world currently at large is a very cognocentric place. I would say, at least in the Western world, we put a lot of credence to what is cognocentric and what makes sense to us, and uncertainty, going into the unknown or even the body is something that's been really judged and taboo for I don't know, thousands of years, or since the advent, I guess, of colonization. So it's a long conversation, but I think that it's because it's not, I mean, it is pretty mainstream. I would say we have over 30 or 40,000 people trained and offering brain spotting all over the world. It's in most countries at this point in the world, and it's growing. So we'll see what happens. But here I am trying to get more awareness.
Spread the word.
Yeah.
Exactly. And talk to me a little bit more about those scientific trials as well, because with any type of concept that can't be proved with black and white evidence, there's going to be doubters, there's going to be people, potentially, and this is the thing, sometimes these type of methodologies and everything aren't for the doubters, but at the same time they will have an opinion, so it's always worth trying to have something that can back that up. So what are these trials showing? You mentioned that obviously there's more effectiveness than certain other modalities, but what exactly are you testing for? And I should imagine that obviously the concept of therapy and everything, I'm sure, would change when you put like a brain scan on someone, or if you put them into a scientific setting, so that's where it makes it difficult, I should say. But I can imagine you can do some brain scans, because of, if you're talking about neural pathways changing, that should be picked up in a brain scan, I should imagine.
Yeah, we've had some smaller studies. We have some brain spotting therapists in the community that are connected to research institutions, and I believe they've done some with fMRI, and then they're also doing EEGs and heart rate variability. That one's really obvious. You can see people's heart rate and the HRV change. The EEGs change in session. People have a lot more stimulated kind of activity, and then the waves change where they become more regulated and calm. So as far as scans go, that's what we've been seeing. But again, at this point, it's like anecdotal. It's not large scale. Some of the more pronounced studies, they compared like CBT, EMDR, brain spotting, and brain spotting was really, really effective, most effective, and very, in close range to EMDR. In some of the other studies, it was in close range to EMDR. What we're looking for is reduction in symptoms. We're looking for our people, when they're coming in for, the treatment, healing, and then even testing 6 months later, how are you doing with those symptoms? And we're seeing that those symptoms were gone. They were reduced. What's interesting about brain spotting is that its long range effect seems to be longer than any of the other modalities, at least at this time. So at that 6-month mark, when they did the retest, people were still seeing a continued reduction in symptoms. What that tells us is that the brain is continuing to reorganize long after you're done with a brain spotting session. It's doing the memory reconsolidation process, and it means that we're going quite deep into the brain, in the subcortex to have that get rewired.
Yeah, that's really positive as well, because I did hypnotherapy maybe it was a long time ago now. I think maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. And I found that initially it was incredibly impactful. So coming back to that percentage, it was a 50% impact immediately, it almost felt incredibly lighter. But then over time, I always thought that there should have been something else, because things kept coming back and just creeping their way back in, to the point where on a long-term basis, it was incredibly effective and it opened up my world in many ways. But in many other ways, I feel that there needed to be something else to kind of put that work into something concrete, to the point it wasn't going to come back. So it's quite nice to hear that modality is something that then stays with you and it continues on a long-term basis, because obviously everyone wants to heal, but they don't want their wounds kind of just healed for a moment, right? They want it healed permanently. And I think that that's maybe some of the challenges of traditional talk therapy. And with that being said, how much talking goes on in a session of brain spotting?
Oh, I'm so
completely
glad
silent, or are you talking, or what's going on in there?
I'm so glad you asked that. So it depends, but there's usually a lot less talking in brain spotting. We can definitely talk more. Certain individuals are going to need more of that verbal communication and connection, and maybe at least especially at first. But here's what happens. When you go into the talking center of the brain, you move out of the subcortex. You go into focusing on the thinking brain. And so when people are in reprocessing mode, if you talk, you're actually pulling them out of that reprocessing, at least to some degree. So we have periods of silence in the processing. We definitely are checking in with folks, but it's not going to be like we're talking throughout the whole thing. We're looking for when you see a nervous system wave kind of go down into more of a parasympathetic calm. So somebody might be like activated and they're, processing something challenging. And as they start to come down from that arc, we're going to check in at that bottom arc and help them kind of get set up for the next wave that shows up in the session. Sometimes there's not a lot of talking. Some clients don't need that. Other times you'll say something and the client's so deep in the reprocessing, they don't even hear you. Like they're not aware and you just let them, go with it. So it's not a talk-based modality in and of itself. And that is because if you think about emotional dysregulation or even physiological dysregulation, that is occurring in the subcortex. That's not a thinking issue. It comes into the thinking brain after. It's a bottom-up approach. So talk therapy is a top-down approach where you're talking to someone and you're trying to get the intervention through their thinking brain into their body to make lasting change. We've got all sorts of defenses, protections. We don't remember things, right? We have dissociation as this beautiful aspect of our brain where when something got really overwhelming, we disconnect from it so that it's like we don't have to think about that and we can function in our daily lives. So talk therapy is trying to like jam this awesome, I was a talk therapist for years and I was like, God, this is so hard, especially working with addiction, which is a very like deeply subcortical issue. The amygdala gets hijacked, the reward pathways in the deep brain get hijacked. Try telling a heroin addict to stop using heroin and just tell them to stop. It doesn't work. You have to get into the body to help them begin to shift. So Brainspotting being bottom up is that we're accessing the felt sense first. As we process the dysregulation, then the thinking naturally changes. You just don't have it anymore. So you don't have to think those things.
And what I like about that is I think it's less intimidating for many people as well. When I went into a hypnotherapist's room for the first time, the first few words I told her is I'm a closed book. Like I wasn't expecting to talk about this. I'm a completely different human now. This was a long time ago, but I wasn't planning on speaking about anything. And obviously it took hypnosis for me to actually start opening up about things, but I can't, and then I've done CBT thereafter and everything along those lines, but I can't imagine going into a CBT session with someone like who I was in the past. Like we wouldn't have gone anywhere. We would have just gone in circles for an hour because I wouldn't have wanted to talk about anything. So I love the idea of the fact that for many people who maybe they're like, I don't want to visit that trauma and I don't really want to open up about this, they don't really have to a degree. And it's nice that there's that other opportunity as well. And I'm curious, obviously in any industry, you have good practitioners and bad practitioners. Are there any green and red flags that we should be looking out for when it comes to someone who's doing this technique with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So having training, obviously, Brainspotting, trained, phase 1 and phase 2 is important. You can start practicing after you take phase 1. Phase 2 gives you the full range. So you might see that on some clinicians' websites. Brainspotting is open to coaches. It's open to people who are in other healing realms. So it's not focused. It's similar to somatic experiencing. If you work with any healing modality, you can get trained in Brainspotting, but it would behoove people to do extra training if you're focused on, like, let's say trauma, right? And you don't have that background knowledge, then we need to have you do some extra training for that. Let's say you're a physical therapist, right? And you know how to work with the body and work with performance. We have physical therapists that are trained in Brainspotting. So if your audience is more focused on sports and fitness and things like that, you could look for folks that are focused and specializing in those realms. We have a lot of therapists that are sports performance focused as well. So looking for that specialty. The certification process also is another green flag. So if somebody says that they're a certified Brainspotting practitioner, they've gone above and beyond and completed the path to certification, which requires a certain number of hours of practice and consultation and specific trainings. So that's another thing to look for. But at the end of the day, the main thing I want to say to your listeners is when you go in to see somebody, you want to feel it in your body that they got your back, right? And if it doesn't feel like that, don't stay. You don't have to put yourself into a situation or, another relationship where you don't feel seen or heard. It's that connection is really important. And the connection is actually going to help your brain heal once you start getting into brain spotting. So obviously, when you go and you meet somebody for the first time or first few sessions, it's like feel into how does your body feel? Are you relaxed with this person? Do they feel relaxed to you? Do they feel open? And trust that. Follow that intuition, because that's your deep brain talking to you, telling you what's going to work and what's not.
Is it an absolute must? And I don't know if this is involved in the training as well, that someone has gone through this themselves, like they've actually done a few sessions on themselves in order to actually become a practitioner?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. So when we do the trainings, you do have to do sessions in the training. So each individual has to do at least 4 sessions that they're receiving and giving in the training itself for both phase 1 and for phase 2. So you have some experiential, but honestly, the therapists that I trust are the ones that are doing it, receiving it themselves. When people ask, how did you get good at this? The technical and the training part, obviously, yeah, that's how I learned how to set up the frameworks, but how I operate and show up in a session is primarily because of how it helped me heal my own nervous system, how I can show up for other people and not be scared, not be nervous, feel like I can totally receive them, is because I was able to do the healing myself. So yeah, that's a really good question that you would want to ask your clinician too.
I think that always has to be the way, because there's just a level of compassion, and especially in something like this, like where, I don't know, for example, if it's a sport, I mean, in any world, to be honest, I think it's important, but give sport as an example. It might not be quite the same if that person hasn't played at a high level, hasn't thrown the ball 7,000 times or whatever that might be. If they're a really good coach and they can get you to the goal of where they want to go. But there is something that I think people miss when they haven't gone through that experience themselves. Like, I'm primarily a health and fitness coach. And when I was much, much younger, I was a little bit overweight, and I had those insecurities. I had that lack of confidence. So even though I've not been 50 kilos overweight like some of my clients have, I can relate to them on many levels, because I know how it feels to have that discomfort, and I know what it feels to get weight off of my frame, etc., etc. Had I been genetically gifted and just come out, and I might have all the technical aspects down, but I can't relate with them on that deep level of like how they're feeling when, they take their shirt off in the mirror or whatever that might be that they're going through. So I think that that's always a valuable trait. It doesn't mean, and this is the beautiful thing about the work that you do, is like, you don't have to go through any big traumas. Like, it could be down to, like you said, performance anxiety in sport or something along those lines. So I think it's very accessible. And, if someone hasn't done it in your industry, it's because of a choice versus them not being able to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the body's talk, right? If you've lived it, your body's holding the memories and the story, and other people's bodies are going to feel that in you just by your presence. You don't have to say anything. They just know.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. This has been a super insightful and eye-opening conversation, Mariya. I really appreciate you sharing this with us and letting us know about this world that was completely foreign to me before we started speaking. And I've got a couple of final questions to wrap up on. The first is, what impact do you want to have on the world with the work that you do?
I want to spread a healing ripple as far across the planet as I can, because the world is in, great need now more than ever, I would say, in some ways. And that's the impact I want to have, whether that's through, working with individuals and groups, and also teaching, because there's only so many hours in the day that I can see clients. And so to be able to speak and share and teach other people to do this, I know that that's getting exponentially magnified. So that's my prayer, my deep heart prayer.
I love it. I love it. And where is the best place for people to find you if they want to keep up with the work that you're doing, or just open themselves up to the world of Brainspotting?
Sure. Yeah. So you can connect with me on my website. It's www.awakenconsultingservices.com. You can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook as well, with those same handles and my business name. And if you want to learn more about Brainspotting, go ahead and check out brainspotting.com. There's a lot of good information on there. There's a Brainspotting book that's very easy to read. There's a Brainspotting and sports performance book too. It's called Your Brain on Sports. Might be an interesting one for your folks to check out. So would love to stay in connection with all of you.
Amazing. We'll make sure we put all of that in the show notes below. But Mari, thank you so much for your time today. I really, truly appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate you.